While Rahul is on his way, I will just say a few sentences by way of introduction. Not to Rahul Kosambi, because he is one of the most well-known spokesmen and theorists of Dalit literature in Marathi. As you very well know, Dalit literature as we know it today, modern Dalit literature, began in Marathi. Very much like many other movements like modernism began in Marathi with B.S. Martekar. Of course, it was not purely a literary movement. Again, you know that you all know about the Dalit Panthers. The Dalit that was a social movement, and Dalit literature in some sense was a reflection of the aspirations and the dreams and the sufferings that were reflected in that were expressed through the Dalit Panther movement. The important thing about Dalit literature in Marathi and elsewhere is that it created a new kind of aesthetics. Perhaps it created a kind of rupture, an epistemological and aesthetic break in literary history by interrogating some of the existing concepts of beauty in literature. Because until then we were, mainly driven by the Sanskrit aesthetics, which Sharan Kumar Limbale has called Brahmin aesthetics, because it gives a lot of importance to, for example, Dhwani or suggestion. And then again, as you very well know, some kinds of language are proscribed. They are not supposed to be used in literature. Some words which are considered, in the traditional aesthetics, ashleela, obscene, or anuchita, which is, improper words. So there were certain, or gramya, which means rural or rustic. So many of these words were kept out of literature. They were not supposed to be used in literature. You had to use a very sophisticated kind of language in literature. This was one of the basic concepts of Sanskrit aesthetics. One is that of propriety, aujitya, as it is called in ancient aesthetics. And the other was Dhwani. You have to be suggestive. You cannot say directly. You have to say indirectly. And even poetry was considered a kind of indirect statement. I'm not going into the theory of Vakrokti and all that, but poetry was supposed to say things very indirectly. But with the arrival of Dalit literature, many of these rules get broken. These rules get questioned. Dalit writers, including poets, begin to use words which were not used in literature until then. If you read, for example, the poetry of someone like Namdev Thasal, or many of those poets, Arvind Kamble and Raja Thale and all those, Daya Pawar, and I'm speaking of the first generation, and we have some of the second generation poets here. If you look at their poetry, and also the kind of fiction that the Dalit writers wrote, and the autobiography, everywhere you find that they are trying to create a new language which would completely express their the premises of their life, their aspirations and dreams, their conflicts, and the suffering they had been subjected to for generations. So they needed to invent a new language, because until then people, they did not have a voice in some sense. And one of the functions of literature ultimately, as I would also see it, is to make the invisible visible and to make the inaudible audible. To create, to bring into visibility what was not seen. So the Dalits, for example, until the writers and the artists began to express themselves, even though they were always expressing, but we had relegated it to what is called oral literature, Vamuri Sahityam. So we did not approve, and our theoreticians never approved of it as great literature. It was supposed to be, folk literature, literature of the ordinary people. But with the coming of the proper Dalit writers, Dalit writing, you find that Dalits actually get a voice. And that voice gradually becomes part of the mainstream. This happens to all movements. And of course, you know that it has both kinds of implications. In one sense, it gets absorbed into the mainstream, which may also kill it in some sense, as in suffocate it. At the same time, it is also a form of recognition. So if you, for example, if you take the name of someone like Namdev Tassal today, Namdev Tassal is not only known as a Dalit writer, but as a major Marathi writer. So along with poets like Arun Kolarkar or Dilip Chitre or the old ones like B.S. Martekar, you can also take the name of Namdev Tassal. He is accepted as a writer even without being qualified as a Dalit writer. And many of the writers, Dalit writers who came after him and along with him also now have become part of the mainstream. Actually, if you look at Marathi literature today, you will find that Dalit literature has already entered the mainstream with Lakshman Mane, Lakshman Gaikwad, Sharan Kumar Limbale. So many of these people who have used fiction, poetry and autobiography as the chief forms of expression, they have become part of the mainstream. And they have also created, as I said, a new aesthetics, breaking the canon, breaking the rules, using improper words, using words which are considered obscene, using words picked up from the slums, picked up from the so-called dirty and the backyard of human life. So there is a kind of frontiarding of backyarding. I am creating words, I know, but that is what exactly happens with Marathi or with Dalit literature. What was in the backyard comes to the front yard. Or, yeah, I remember Anandamurthy using the word, the blossoming of the backyard. So the backyard begins to blossom. The parts which were ignored, dark, left, marginalized, suddenly that part begins to blossom. It begins to create a new kind of beauty, a new kind of, it has a new kind of voice. And so that becomes a major break. I will not, of course, I leave things to Rahul. I will only say that it began in Marathi, but as many of you might know, now at least in 12 of the major, so-called major, I won't again use major, minor, etc. I use the terms very carefully, but what I mean is the scheduled languages of India. You have a strong body of Dalit literature. From Marathi, it travels to Gujarati. You have writers like Joseph McQuan, the novelist, and Joseph McQuan, the poet, and quite a few other people. I have many names in my mind. And so, and then Marathi, Gujarati, and then you find in Hindi a major group of writers beginning to emerge from the Dalit community, giving expression to their sorrows and their conflicts and their dreams of a new life in an incomplete democracy that we are condemned to live in. And then it spreads to other languages, and it has now in Malayalam also there are writers who would like to claim proudly that they are Dalit writers. In fact, one of our writers at least began as a mainstream poet. S. Joseph, for example. No, he never called himself a Dalit writer to begin with. He was already accepted as a very important poet of that generation. But even he, at one point, felt that I need to mark my identity as a Dalit writer, because he was using a different language, the language used by workers, especially bamboo cutters and all that. He was using words which were not part of the mainstream language, which would not be understood by a lot of common Malayali readers of poetry, because I have translated his poetry and I know how difficult it was. I had to ask him many times, what does that word mean? What does this expression mean? So, which means there is a new language coming up, and it is coming up in many of the languages of India, all the South Indian languages, and also Bengali, then Odia language, and as we already said, Hindi and Marathi and Gujarati. So quite a few languages now have a sizable corpus of Dalit literature, which has produced a new which has given voice to Dalits. That's the sociological importance. But aesthetically, it is important because it created a new language and a new aesthetics, new norms, breaking, as I said, the canons and the conservative concept, aesthetic concepts that had informed literature until then. This is the general context in which Rahul is going to present Marathi Dalit literature. I believe he will speak about the writers, he will speak about the various trends and genres, and also something about Dalit aesthetics, on which very little has been written, except by Sharan Kumar Limbale, and I am sure you have written probably in Marathi, but we mostly have read in English Sharan Kumar Limbale's book on Dalit aesthetics. But I think there are more things to say, and I leave it to you to say more about.
First of all, I would like to thank you, the organizers, to given me an opportunity to present my views in front of this learned gathering. Actually, a background has already been set up, especially from the artistic and aesthetical point of view. But I wanted to talk to you about Dalit literature in a very different sense. That means, when I was asked on which topic you would like to speak on, especially on Marathi literature, because I have already thinking on it in a very different perspective. I told them that I would like to focus upon understanding Dalit literature in contemporary challenges, because now that is the crux of this particular subject. Once we have seen the days, the golden days of Dalit literature, once upon a time, especially 70s, 80s, 19 up till. But after 90s, especially when we are calling it as a neoliberal era or globalization era, the era of globalization, something different has been happening in Dalit literature. And I would call it straightly, it is the crisis of Dalit literature. And I would like to explain what I mean by crisis of Dalit literature. First of all, the concept Dalit, you all might know that it is actually started in 1960s. Maharashtra Dalit Sahitya Sangh, which was actually formed in early 50s, what actually in 1958, it has actually coined the concept called as Dalit. It is not that Dalit as a concept, especially a political concept, was not there. It was always present. It was there. And it was a commonsensical political consciousness of the Dalit as such, especially the so-called untouchables, pre-untouchables at that time. So it was in 1960, the whole concept of Dalit literature was started. And you will find that in 1963 or 65, none other than Baburao Bagul, the leading, one of the celebrated Marathi Dalit author, has actually brought his two short story collections. One is Jewa Mi Jaat Chorli Hoti, that is called as When I Stole My Caste, in two different senses. Because in Chorli, that is to stole, it is in English it is only stole, but in Marathi there are two senses. Chorli means to chura lena, apna badan chura lena, to shrink yourself actually, and to stole something of others. That these two connotations were there. And then his next story collection was Maran Swastha Hota, that is death is becoming cheap. That is the starting point of Dalit literature, and you will surprised to know that Baburao Bagul was the fundamental, was the instrumental personality to form or to give ideological inputs in the formation of Dalit Panthers in 1972. So he was the backbone, the back pillar of, ideological back pillar of Dalit Panthers movement. So the Dalit literature was actually having two distinct connotations, one caste and another a class understanding of it. So it was started with caste and class understanding of Dalit literature. But later on, there are so many other people who actually started working into different genres, especially poetry, other short story writers, and later on in 70s onwards, when the so-called Dalit autobiographies were started coming into, a different genre has been established and been introduced. And it has its own politics then. So it was started clearly with caste and class combination to understand the Indian reality. and to express themselves in a very different ideologically. So Shankarao Kharat, then we have a very unique personality in Dalit literature called as Baburao Bagul. When I am saying, not Baburao Bagul, but when I am saying Baburao Bagul as a class and caste combination, there is another personality called Annabhau Sathe, who is actually through and through communist because he actually worked into communist politics, started writing literature. He was actually from Mang community, not Mahar community, which Baba Saheb was actually born into. And he was very much into the politics called as Sanyukta Maharashtra agitations. So Sanyukta, that is combined Maharashtra formation. So that was the ideological history of Annabhau Sathe. He was the person who was actually representing the three different aspects of ideology. One is typical modern Maharashtrian ideology, then communist, and then Dalit. So this is the combination. So I want to convey you that the Dalit literature, the first Dalit literature, was started very maturely. Not only underlining the caste identities, but they were looking at caste identities from a very different, unique, holistic understanding. It includes definitely caste and larger modern politics as such. But if you go into the history, because I'm going to definitely speak on, because I have left to a very small time actually, but definitely I want to speak on exactly what you mean by definitional crisis of Dalit literature, and I will little bit ponder upon that. But give me, because definitional crisis can emerge when you stretch a definition to its extreme, and when you make it very narrow. In both sense, definitional crisis may happen. So when we try to understand Dalit, we may include non-Brahmin or non-anti-Vedic or anti-Brahminic traditions also. If you look into from that perspective, you will find then Buddha, and then Charvaka, and then whole Bhakti movement. All you can then compartmentalize that particular tradition into Dalit literature. But this is a far overstretched definition or understanding of Dalit literature, or you may become very narrow. I'm going to speak upon that one. So, but specifically, especially from if you go into the Bhakti movement, you were having so many Dalit voices in that particular this one. Especially when I want to talk about Maharashtra, you will find many, especially Chokha Mela, then his son Karma Mela, and there are so many. And if you include whole women's into the Dalit category, then there are a whole lot of women's in that particular this one and their own expressions. So it is very clear that Dalit literature is a modern phenomena, and it includes not only casteist understanding of the reality, but both caste and class and even modern politics. Then we have a post-independence phenomena called as the Dalit Panthers as such, where that particular class understanding was actually been taken to a new extreme, and there that particular definitional crisis was actually tried to a little bit rectified by the Dalit Panthers. They have defined Dalit in a very different perspective, and that may include so many castes which is not fallen into the category called as untouchables. You may include so many non-touchable castes which are vulnerably in a destitute situation. You can include, and you can even include a gender perspective where you can include women into that one. So they have actually broadened the whole concept and somehow tried to rectify the definitional crisis of Dalit Panther. But somehow the politics at that time was so narrow. It was just in 2 years it was got fragmented, and it has been dissolved by none other than Raja Dhale at that time. So later on, that particular legacy or that particular definitional crisis we are still carrying on into Marathi tradition. Definitely, we are now into the era of globalization, and when we are talking Dalit literature into the era of globalization, we need to highlight because we are altogetherly living into qualitatively different times, definitely. If you see in 70s or 80s, all these Dalit writers are actually uh, first, you can say, entrant into the so-called middle class at that time. And that too, that middle class was actually carved out, you can say, deliberately made by the state apparatuses. Because in 70s and 80s, when employments were being generated at the state apparatuses, that were actually been available to the newly educated Dalit classes, they occupied it, and then they have started their own politics. So the middle class, the Dalit middle class connotations is highly problematic here. They have not actually carved out their own space in private sectors or in other, we can say, business opportunities. So it is tied with the state. And that's why it has actually erupted its own style of politics as such. But in globalization era, something new was started happening. And that too, we have actually come up with a new, or you can say new Dalit middle class as such, where the generation of this particular new middle classes were actually into the different areas of employment and all these things. And these generations have their own problems with the identity. The material conditions, the socio-political condition in the globalization era has actually pushed Dalits into different realities. I'll go into one by one, and then I will explain you what I actually want to mean it. I find it that actually now Dalit literature or Dalit politics or Dalit existential identity itself is under going through some crisis, and there are multiple versions of crisis. I actually enlisted some of them, and they might be first of all identity crisis. Identity formation is a very peculiar process where you can you can put some people into put particular group into a juxtaposition with the other, and then you will come to know what is exactly the identity is. But here, in that particular process, you are actually homogenizing that particular identity. X is against Y, X community is against Y, but here you are actually imagining the content of X is homogeneous. But if you look into the Dalit category, you will see that there are not only caste hierarchies still prevail and practice in Asprusha categories, but there are, even now because of this globalization era, new class alignments have actually come up, and that actually distorted, or you can say heterogenized, the whole concept of Dalit as such. Dalit is not a homogeneous. Okay. Okay, but this is identity crisis. Actually, now Dalits are again researching their own identity because they are actually going through turmoil. Because the class and the caste and subcaste, they are actually asserting, especially at the political and social level, their own identities. So there is a confusion of identity. There are multiple identities that are actually thriving into the concept of Dalits. Ideological crisis because we have inherited the whole concept called as Dalit from Ambedkarism. None other than Ambedkar actually has given the concept called as Dalit. But if you look into the whole politics of Ambedkar, he is very clear about something. That is, he is staunchly against caste. He wants to simply eradicate the caste system. He is simply against not religion, but he wanted to be religion more like a moral than the rules and regulations or code. He treated religion as a source of morality, not as a book called as a book with codes and rules and regulations where you have to follow it blindly. No, you have to question it. You have to look it again and again. So there should be a space where you can search and research your own morality. That was his understanding of religion. Then he was categorically anti-Brahmin. In 1937, when he was actually giving speech in Yaula, he was categorically told that there are two biggest enemies in front of Dalits. That is, one is Brahmanism and another is capitalism. So fourth one is anti-capitalism is the essence of Ambedkarism. But if you look into the politics, the sociology, if you look into the sociological perspective into the Dalits, they were hardly anti-caste remained. They were hardly anti-capitalist. They were hardly not only not critical about religion, but they are actually following rules and regulations and rituals as actually opposed to. It is nothing but the reaction to the Brahmanic, this one. So they were following the same logic and anti-Brahmanic also. So the ideology of Ambedkar was actually, the core of ideology, Ambedkar ideology is being distorted by the Dalit themselves. Then I won't talk about crisis of morality, but then crisis of living, because globalization has actually distorted literally everything. Dalits who are 85% Dalits are living in rural areas are actually becoming landless laborers, no employments, healthcare, education, and the whole debate. From last 2 days, we are actually having different opinions on reservation. This is what happening with Dalit and their own reservation. Only remaining empowerment policy. It has been deliberately been destroyed by the so-called the state apparatus. And even then, there are some Dalit leaders are actually in complicit with that particular this one. So I want to come to the Dalit literature now, because if you have identity crisis, if you have living crisis, if you have existential crisis, if you have political crisis, if you have morality crisis, you definitely be into a crisis of creativity. There is a creativity crisis now. If you look into the Dalit poetry or Dalit short story writing, Dalit novel or Dalit autobiography, you will find that all these genres are actually been into crisis. We haven't heard a name after, if you say Arun Kale or now sitting Pradnya Dayapawar, we don't have any name beyond that, because after Namdev Dasal, then Prakash Jadhav, and then Arun Kale, who has actually tried to understand globalization from a typical Dalit perspective, where he again used or culminated the class and caste understanding of understanding reality. We don't find any notable voices in poetry. That too, again, in short story writing. Baburao Bagul, and there are so many others, but you will not find very notable writers, especially writing very good short stories. Same with novels, but something different is happening in autobiography. Now, autobiographies are being written other than Ambedkarite. The other castes, especially in untouchables like Mangs, Dos, and other Dalit castes are actually writing their own autobiographies. And that again actually created the crisis of definition. Now, the Dalit writers are not only talking about Dalit literature, they have started talking about Ambedkarite literature, because they said that it is only Ambedkar who has actually provided the ideological source to the Dalit literature. And if you are not Ambedkarite, you cannot write Dalit literature. But what about Mang, who don't believe in Ambedkarite, but still want to express his agony, still want to express his sorrowness, still want to express his own politics? What to do with them? And then again, they have stretched it to the Buddhism, because they said at the last moment, Ambedkar has actually embraced Buddhism, and this is the last solution he has given to the anti-caste, anti-Brahmin, anti-capitalist, and anti-religion. Buddhism is the sole and the final answer to the Dalits. So if you are not Ambedkarite, we are okay, but you have to be Buddhist. If you are not converting to the Buddhist, it would be very difficult. So the ideological crisis has actually given rise to the definitional crisis also, and this particular reality is not being grasped by the writers, the poets and poetess and short story writers, and even critical thinkers. And this is the crisis, what I mean to you as crisis of creativity and crisis of definition. I'll stop here, and I will invite some questions from your side, and I will try my best to answer you, though may not satisfy you. Or I will request anybody here from the learned audience, if I don't have any answer, you can add to that particular answer. Thank you very much again for your patient listening.
Hello, sir. Actually, I attended this session because I was curious about this Marathi literature. And during my initial days of my career, I had been in Savantwadi in Sindhur district for about 2 years. And when I Googled it regarding about the Dalit literature in Marathi, I was surprised to know that the modern Dalit literature actually started in Maharashtra in 1950s and 60s. So, but the land terrain or geography which I experienced in Sindhur or Savantwadi, the southern Maharashtra, it's a most oppressed part of the country actually I have seen in my during my small life. So, how much this Dalit literature has affected the Dalit movement in Maharashtra? Means this part of the state which I have seen was I don't know how to express it, but it was it's a district which was most oppressed when comparing to the other districts in Maharashtra.
Yes, actually, it's a very good question. You will be surprised to know that the first anti-feudal movement, or you can say protest, was started none other than by Dr. Ambedkar in Maharashtra. He was through and through anti-feudal. He was actually started Khoti movement in Konkan, and to support him, there were lots of non-Dalit actually joined hands with him, and they fought like anything. And somehow, I don't know, Tilak was at that time was against the Ambedkar, and he actually supported the Khoti bill. So the whole societal nature of Konkan is completely different. Actually, the Khoti system is it's replica of Zamindari system in Maharashtra. If you consider or compare with other parts of the Maharashtra, other parts of Maharashtra is actually what you can say a Rayatwari system. That is the tax collected directly from the ryots or the farmers. But in Konkan, it was Khots like Jamidars. They were feudal lords, and they actually subjugated all other castes under them like anything. They are at the subhuman level. And Ambedkar, none other than Ambedkar, has actually fought against the Khoti system. But that is actually, I'm trying to convince. Actually, Ambedkar is the, you might definitely know that Ambedkar has actually established the first workers' party in India. It was in Independent Labour Party. And Independent Labour actually carried its own red flag actually. It was not blue flag. Somehow who actually invented the blue flag, I don't know. But it was started with Independent Labour Party, and it was with red flag. So he was the person who had actually started first labor movement, labor party in India. He actually led the first anti-feudal protest in India. So, but this particular history has to be convinced in a very different sense. And then only you can write or you can reflect upon the actual, the plight of the masses at that time. And that is actually now missing. I could have elaborated on so many things because I want to actually underline the contemporary politics, but this is not actually because I don't have time at that time. But yes, exactly, it is not happening.
You were talking about the crisis of, Marathi Dalit literature. So I want to point out that there are, say, films like, say, Sairat or Fundry or Court, for instance, which talk about caste in a very strong fashion in Maharashtra. But at the same time, we also have something like, say, the kind of issues that cropped up with the celebration of the Bhima Koregaon, the commemorations that happens 2 years back, and the kind of things happened along with that. A lot of Dalit sympathizers, such political solidarity is being termed as Naxal and such like. So, and again in the light of, say, the Maratha, they were asking for reservation, and the kind of say silent march they did across Maharashtra, the rape case of that Maratha girl. So there are a lot of things. So if we consider that the fact that right now we have, say, film, media, social media, etc., as the powerful media for, say, social change. And given the political or the social nature of Dalit literature in the earlier sense, probably, I mean, can we say that Dalit youth or Dalit creative minds are moving more towards, say, the other modes of expression rather than literature?
Yes, exactly. This is happening actually. After more than 100 years, a Dalit perspective has been introduced in Marathi film, and it has created havoc actually. The Fandry, then it was started with Pistulia, a short film, then Fandry, and then Sairat. And he has actually set his own tone and language into the Marathi film, the film tradition as such. Yes, but they are in minority. Actually, again, Nagaraj is doing that. And the quote is not directed by Dalit, it's actually on Dalit lives, but not directed or considered by Dalit as such. Yes, then that is what I actually wanted to speak with you, that the nature of Dalit politics, the nature of Dalit social status has actually been in turmoil, completely changing. And actually it is now actually giving birth to different types of perspectives and combinations. That is actually beyond, still we are grappling with to understand it. It's confusing state. What to do with Maratha Morcha, how to understand Bhima Koregaon, because it was I who wrote a very polemical piece against the whole understanding of Bhima Koregaon event in Maharashtra. I actually opposed it because, see, it was none other than Mahatma Phule who has actually understand the core problem of Dalit is nothing but the lack of education. He started with Vidya. And he said that if you want to modernize yourself, if you want to empower yourself, you have to throw away your talwar or whatever the military occupations you have actually been focused on to, but you have then now take on education like anything. You have to thrive into education. Talwar chhod ke kalam le lo. But now what the whole Bhima Koregaon idea is talking about? Yes, 20 seconds. So they were actually telling us that in Bhima Koregaon, some few Mahar soldiers were fought against Peshwa. I don't know whom exactly fought against whom, but somehow they are Mahar soldiers and they were actually having a great valor and sword in the hand. What about education? These are not the symbols. We don't want feudal symbols now. But apart from that, I am actually with them on tactical level. Tactical level, yes. Because we are having again a new Peshwai called as Fadnavis government in Maharashtra, and how to deal with it. Yes, tactically I am with you, but theoretically I have to be much more critical about it, because if theory is distorted, even your tactics can be distorted very easily. That I mean. Thank you very much.